commercial space is really straightforward. Someone will make an announcement, they will likely post that on their website somewhere, and then you now have like a really firm either end of maintenance, end of life, or end of support kind of status. Now the question is then, how do you obtain that in a consistent way, right? Of course, there's the, let me just kind of grind through it, look up all of my commercial components, maintain an Excel sheet of that and be able to communicate that information. Obviously, that is very unsatisfactory for me as a product manager. I think then going to the open source side of it, that challenge then becomes exponential because that communication is oftentimes either doesn't exist in the first place. There are some data sources such as like endoflife.date and a few other ones that there's a few standards like Open EOX who are looking to address this challenge. But oftentimes developers either don't communicate it or it's hidden in change logs and Git repositories. And so it's interesting because I've chatted with the FDA about this challenge, and it is a best assessment is my understanding at this time. And by best assessment, I think there's a couple of factors that you can look at. One of them is how often has the code base been contributed to? And so from our perspective, something that has not had any update from the maintainer over the course of the last 2 years is clearly abandoned. Now that 2 years mark may actually be too conservative for you, right? Maybe for you, it's a shorter timeline, which I know, Trevor, you can speak to here in a bit. And then I think the second piece that I just really want to point to is just because a particular piece of open source software has not been contributed to in a long time, doesn't actually mean that it is abandoned, right? Maybe it's just, for lack of a better term, feature complete. It doesn't necessarily need new functionality, but it is a massive signal that if a new vulnerability comes out, what is the likelihood that that will actually be addressed by those open source maintainers? And so would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that side, Trevor.
Yeah, I feel like you touched up on a couple of really important points there. So my general rule of thumb that I like to stick with is 6 months is usually cause for concern. If we don't see any activity going on in 6 months, it's worth at minimum exploring a little bit deeper. Now, there can be a couple of reasons. It could just be that maintainer doesn't want to support it anymore, got tired of it, and stopped supporting the product. You see vulnerabilities pop up, you don't see any new activity. It could also be the case you look into it and you see that there's just sporadic updates as vulnerabilities may come in. And kind of like you said, it would be feature complete. They don't plan on making any changes to the core functionality. They are more just playing catch up with any problems that pop up. And so that would often indicate that if those are being addressed as they're discovered every 3 to 6 months, whatever it may be, that may just indicate that that's the only development cycle. There isn't any continuous development ongoing, and that would be of less cause for concern. Now, once we get into the 1 year, 2 year range, like you said, that's usually a pretty clear indication that development is done. It's not common that components will be left out for longer than a year or two without any new vulnerabilities being discovered, especially well-used components. I know a colleague of mine has talked to me a lot about the process to develop truly bug-free code, and he did it as part of his master's program, and I want to say it was something like 40 pages of proof for 2 lines of code to prove it was completely bug-free. So it's pretty slim on the odds that you would see a year or two with no development and no vulnerabilities pop up.
That's insane.
Again, it can be a case-by-case basis. And so if you see sort of that scattered development, it's just something worth looking into a little bit more.
And how do you think about communicating support information, right? So my understanding is that there is no SBOM format, specifically CycloneDX and SPDX, that has native support for communicating end of life. This is something that we handle at FOSSA with a property, a custom property on the CycloneDX side. I know that also today there is actually not an FDA requirement to specifically embed end of life support information in the SBOM, as much as that is a convenient way to communicate that, as I believe it is a separate form on the submission side of the house. And so I'm kind of curious as to how do you think about communicating that information? Is that a Excel sheet in your mind? Like how are people doing that for your world?
Oftentimes it would just be a very large Excel sheet, which, is not an ideal solution. So as part of our approach when we're going through a full submission, we look at sort of the plan to remediate these as they come up. So we'll document what the current support is for a product and see if it's expected to continue receiving support, all of that as we're going through an initial assessment. Next part is we prepare specific documentation saying this is how we're tracking end of life. This is what we're going to do if we see something reaches end of life. This is our assessment procedure. All of that is covered as sort of a blanket coverage statement, so that it's an ongoing, continuous process instead of just one and done. We say, this is the anticipated end of support for all of these, whether or not they're currently active, ship it out the door. So it's a continuous process, making sure that we're tracking everything as it's ongoing.
And then maybe just my last question on this piece of it is, what are those kind of steps or guidance, whatever you're comfortable sharing, that a customer can do when they do experience end of life or end of support, packages, right? Obviously, there's the rip and replace is the easy one, but I'm sorry, the easy one to think of, the much more difficult one to implement for a product that's already out there in the wild. And so, yeah, what are some of your opinions there?
Definitely. So as purely cybersecurity, tester side, application security, I don't come from a developing background. And so when I say, oh, it's an easy solution, just replace this with that, I always hear developers immediately tell me, no, it's never like that. So I understand all the problems that may come up as part of that process. If it's possible to replace it with a different component, fantastic. It's often easier said than done, but sometimes it is just that easy. You're able to replace it with an equivalent component, make some minor changes here and there, and then see what you can do from there. Now, the alternative, and this is often the what needs to happen if there is no viable solution, is either essentially creating your own spinoff or a fork of that component. So the fork of that component can address the specific problems, and creating a spinoff, doing it from scratch and maintaining it yourself is an alternative solution. It's often going to be a lot more labor intensive when just creating a fork. It's one of the beautiful things about the open source community. All of these are pushed out. You can create your own changes and then include that as needed.
Really love that. I'll even throw a third one out there as a open source champion, which is, at the end of the day, if you are a company that is actually in a position where you're heavily relying on an open source package that is no longer maintained, maybe even consider reaching out to the maintainer itself and seeing if there's a commercial agreement that you can establish there to incentivize some of that additional support status. If it works for Microsoft, I think the open source maintainers can pull it up too.